Então, boa tarde a todas e a todos. I think we should talk in English because the lectures will take place in English. Hello, greetings to Joana Gomes, the representative of the ILO Lisbon office. Thank you for coming. You are very welcome once again. And thanks for your excellent cooperation. This cooperation, you know, is not new, but I should acknowledge the ILO office in Lisbon by its commitment with FEUC, building together this ILO chair project on labor issues and challenges. This is a very important project. Mafalda Tronches, the head of the Lisbon ILO office, has been a very kind and important partner in this process also. So greetings to Mafalda. She's not here this year. My second acknowledgement is addressed to my colleague and good friend Hermes Costa, the soul of this project of the FEUC ILO share. If we have until the moment 6 editions of the ILO share, I think it is fair to recognize that this excellent and persistent work has been done mostly by Professor Hermes Costa, as an expert on labor sociology and trade unions sociology, you know. My third and last acknowledgement is addressed to our speakers, Sofia Amaral de Oliveira and Maria Prieto. Thank you for coming and for being here. You are very welcome also. Both topics are very important discussions within the goals of the ILO share. Maritime labor issues, you know, and I have been research on the topic, mainly fisheries, but maritime labor issues have always been a very hard and specific topic for ILO's conventions and efforts to regulate working and living conditions on board. Since the 20s, since the beginning of the ILO work. Currently, most of the shipping crews, I think all we know, are immigrants for poor countries, and shipping never being a territory of high compliancy of human rights and labor rights, you know. Even distant water fisheries, the question is similar, not exactly the same as the current situation of shipping, because it's a very global activity, and mostly of the crews are in fact immigrants from Bangladesh, from Philippines, and so on. I think this data will be shown probably. The second topic is also very important, especially for our students, for our society in general. In the recent weeks and months, we had bad news on the youth employment data in Portugal. So I think the topic is very important to discuss here within the ILO share. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the students of Sociologia das Organizações, I guess, yes, for attending these lectures. I think it's a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon. Then I just would like to say a few words on the subject. First of all, thank you for the speakers of today's session. This is the 6th edition of the ILO chair, and just a few of you, a very brief background on the subject. This idea of creating an ILO chair at faculty was basically the result of an initiative that we have organized in the academic year of 2016-2017, which was the simulation of the International Labour Conference. I've seen João, some of those. At that time, we had around 300 students participating in that simulation of the ILO conference, and since then, we decided to create. We signed an agreement with the ILO precisely on the constitution of an ILO chair, and since then, every year we have been organizing seminars with different experts of the ILO. Just to make a very brief recall of the topics we have discussed during the last 5 years, and this is the 6th one. I would basically say we discussed high-low history, we have discussed green jobs, digital economy, gender pay gap, platform economy, right to disconnect, the economy of care, inequalities at work, automotive sector, child labor, labor inspectorate, social protection, and today the convention of seafarers and youth employment. So we have a lot and diverse lot of teams, and today I'm very happy to receive you again today, this 6th edition. I also my thanks to Joana Gomes on behalf of the ILO. So the session will be, and she will present the speakers right now, but the session will be basically, we're going to have these 2 seminars around 30 minutes, 35 minutes each one, and after the seminars, we're going to have a space for questions, for debate, and that's it. Thank you very much. Joana.
Good afternoon. On behalf of our director, Mafalda Troncho, she couldn't be here today as she is in a mission in Angola, but she asked me to convey our thanks to the Faculty of Economy in Coimbra for this fruitful cooperation all over the years. It's been already, as it's already been said, we are in the 6th edition, and I would like to welcome the presence of our 2 speakers, Mrs. Sofia Oliveira and Mrs. Maria Preto. So I'll give you a short bio on each one. Mrs. Sofia Amaral de Oliveira is like welcoming home, because she used to work with us in ILO Lisbon, but now she is in Geneva, and we are very happy that she is able to be here with us today to present his presentation. Will name Bill of Rights for Seafarers, 10 years on the entry into force of the ILO Maritime Convention 2006. Sophie is currently a legal specialist in the Maritime Unit of the International Labour Standards Department at the International Labour Organization headquarters in Geneva. Throughout her professional life, she has contributed to the revision of labor laws, minimum wage setting through social dialogue, to the adoption of work-life balance measures, and the promotion of gender equality and decent working conditions in Europe and Africa. She joined the ILO in 2009 as associate expert in our ILO Lisbon office, where she was responsible for liaising with the Executive Secretariat of the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, and participating in technical assistance initiatives directed to those countries on labor inspection, as well as on the elimination of child labor and forced labor. She later worked at ILO Decent Work Team for Central and Eastern European countries in Budapest as a specialist in working conditions, employment, and gender equality, and afterwards as International Labour Standards and Labour Law Specialist for West Africa based in Dakar, where she provided legal assistance to government and social partners for policy formulation, drafting of labor legislation and ratification, implementation and dissemination of international labor standards, and on a variety of subjects. Prior to joining the ILO, she worked at the Ministry of Labour and Social Solidarity in Portugal and in the private sector. As a lawyer enrolled in the Portuguese Bar Association. She holds a degree in law from the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon, where she later obtained a specialization in international law and international relations, and a postgraduate degree in labor and social security law from the University Nova in Lisbon. Now we're back to Maria Prieto. She will be presenting a session on ILO's response to the global youth employment challenge. Maria is an employment and future of work specialist in the employment, labor markets, and youth branch at ILO's headquarters, also in Geneva. In her current position, she leads the work of two interrelated strategic topics of youth employment and digitalization. Maria coordinates the implementation of the ILO's governing body approved Youth Employment Action Plan 2020-2030, as well as leads the work on digitalization in the context of national employment policies. The action plan supports ILO member states around the world in the creation of decent work for young people. Previously, Maria worked as a specialist in the ILO's Future of Work initiative, where she provided technical support to the Global Commission on the Future of Work and to work of the ILO on the subject. Maria has more than 18 years of professional experience in the UN, ILO, and UNDP, in positions that included thematic areas such as youth employment, digitalization, local economic and social development, public-private partnerships for urban environment, small and micro enterprises, informal economy, and infrastructure development. Just to finish before we pass on the word to our colleagues, I would just like to give you a final note that if you want to have listen or consult about the teams on the previous editions of this share that our colleague has just presented us, the faculty has gathered all the tests of the ILO specialists who, throughout all these various editions, have animated sessions on the most current themes about the future of work. This publication is available online. You can consult the ILO share at FEUC, Talks on the Future of Work. It's completely free. You just have to download it and you'll be able to consult every issue that have already been dealt with. And now I think we can pass on the word to our colleagues.
So thank you very much for the Faculdade de Economia da Universidade de Coimbra and to ILO Lisbon for inviting me to participate in the 6th edition of this ILO chair. It is a pleasure for me to be at this university and at this session with you to speak about a topic which is very dear to my heart. Although I'm not a long-term specialist like the dean of your university, it's a subject that is really fascinating, and indeed it has been a concern of the ILO for over 100 years. So before we move on to the in-depth of the subject, so I just want to say, if you have any clarification that you would like to ask, please do not hesitate, just raise your hand. Otherwise, at the end of the presentations, we will have a session on questions and answers. I don't know if you can hear me well in the back of the room. Okay, perfect. So my presentation, I'll try to keep it short. I have a lot to tell you, but I will try to focus on some important aspects, which is basically where do we come from? So the Maritime Labour Convention is now this year celebrating its 10th anniversary of being in force, so not of being adopted, but of being in force. And so I will just go through very quickly where we come from to reach to this convention. What is the situation today? So 10 years after the entry into force of the convention, what has changed since its adoption in 2006? And just to conclude, leave you with some brief impressions on what lies ahead and what are some of the challenges in this sector for the future. And a brief disclaimer, I'm a lawyer, as you could hear from the presentation before, so if I become a bit too technical, please excuse me, but it's a professional default. And it is a very technical subject. And my presentation is supposed to be a legal perspective. So apologies already, perhaps, and I hope you will be encouraged to look at this topic from a different perspective, an economic perspective or a sociological perspective, or even a maritime perspective. So just briefly going through a little reminder of what is the ILO, its origins and mission. So the ILO was created in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles on the basis that universal and lasting peace cannot be achieved without social justice. So the mission of the ILO since its inception has been the promotion of social justice, and it has a very particular characteristic. It is the only international organization which encompasses the participation of governments, employers, and workers in an equal footing. An equal footing with a caveat, because it's true that in the conferences the governments have 2 delegates and 2 votes, and the employers have 1 and then the workers have 1. But in the end, it is true that the employers and the workers participate in the work of the ILO in all the aspects of the work of the ILO on an equal footing with the governments, and that means adopting international instruments, international binding treaties once ratified, which are conventions. We call them international labor standards, which is unique in the international system. So any other international instrument that is adopted in the context of international organizations is adopted by governments, with more or less consultations, but it's adopted by governments. In the case of the ILO, all the standards that are adopted by the ILO are so with the participation of workers and governments. So this characteristic probably was what ensured the survival of the ILO from the demise of the Société des Nations, when it was dismantled with the advent of World War II. And since 1946, the ILO is the first specialized agency of the United Nations, and it continues to promote its objective of achieving universal peace through the realization of social justice by the realization of the decent work agenda, meaning the promotion of employment creation, ensuring social protection for all, rights at work, and through social dialogue. This objective of decent work that is fulfilled by the ILO has now become a global objective, and it's part of the SDGs, which all are committed to achieve by 2030. So, after telling you briefly the history of 100 years of ILO in 3 or 4 minutes, I just wanted to point out that the issue of maritime labor has always had a specific treatment in the action of the ILO. It has been a concern of the ILO since its foundation. Already in 1920, at the second session of the ILC, the members of the ILO realized that shipping was inseparable from world trade and economic development, because access to inexpensive and reliable transportation had a direct impact on competitiveness of exports and imports, which in turn affected a wide range of economic activities. And this sector had particular challenges to the international legal system, because workers who work in shipping, so maritime workers, are drawn from many countries, and they work in a workplace which is moving between different jurisdictions, and also the employers or the ship owners to which they provide their work are equally fluid. So this truly international sector requires the adoption of specific regulation, and this was understood already by the ILO members in 1920. And another special characteristic of the sector is that the participation in the adoption of normative instruments in the sector is done by representatives of ship owners and seafarers, which are different than the general employers and workers representatives who participate in the normal activities of the ILO. So, from the beginning of the creation of the ILO, the ship owners and the seafarers, so the social partners of the maritime sector, required that for the discussion of maritime issues, the ILO should consult with them, who knew about the circumstances and the conditions of the sector, and not with the general representatives of social partners. And this meant that when they met at the International Labour Conference, they would do so in special sessions called maritime sessions, and the first one took place in 9 July 1920. And at this session, they adopted a recommendation which envisaged the task of establishing an international seamen's code. So this was in 1920, and since then, there were another 8 maritime sessions in which the ILO adopted over 68 maritime standards between conventions and recommendations and protocols on a wide range of issues, including minimum age, hours of work and rest for seafarers, social security, pensions for seafarers, labor inspection, etc. And so within this long period of time, there were almost 70 instruments adopted on maritime labor. However, by 2001, the seafarers and the ship owners realized that the shipping sector had evolved, and notably by the opening of the national registers, flag registers, to foreign owners, and this opening of international registers led to the existence of a global labor supply market for seafarers, and therefore a broader internationalization of the sector, and an even more tenuous relationship between the flag state and the seafarer. And therefore, the seafarers' representatives and the ship owners concluded that the existing standards were no longer ensuring decent work in the sector. They were no longer enough, not only because they were not keeping up with the developments of the shipping industry, but also because they were unevenly ratified by member states, and they were especially unevenly enforced or insufficiently enforced. So this meant that there was no longer a level playing field in the sector, and it was very difficult for convincing member states to ratify these standards because they were so piecemeal, covering so many specific different aspects, that it required an extremely hard burden for the member states, for the governments, to ratify them, go through all the procedures, and then apply them. So in this context, the social partners agreed that it would be necessary to consolidate these existing standards into one framework convention. And through this agreement, which is called the Geneva Accord, which is a bipartite agreement, they considered that the development of this consolidated instrument should be the priority for the maritime sector in the coming years. In this agreement, they also indicated that the instrument should include an accelerated amendment procedure, because the process to revise an ILO convention once it's adopted is very lengthy. It takes at least 2 sessions of the International Conference, so at least 2 years, just to make a revision of that instrument, and it requires a lot of time, but also resources to ensure the consensus for this revision. So in 2006, after 5 years of lengthy or deep discussions between the social partners and the governments, the MLC, the Maritime Labour Convention, was adopted. And after 86 years and 70 conventions, it finally translated this vision of 1920 of the creation of an international Seamen's Code. And it finally translated the realization by the whole industry that poor working conditions and quality shipping cannot go together. So to have quality shipping, it is necessary to ensure decent work and to have good working conditions on board. So the Maritime Labour Convention is therefore considered the Seafarers' Bill of Rights because it broadly regulates all aspects of work and living on board the ships. And in its preamble and in Articles 3 and 4, it sets the requirements of decent work in maritime labor within a human rights framework, notably ensuring the need to ensure fundamental principles and rights at work for seafarers. And then the various obligations, the various rights of seafarers are expressed throughout the text through the different titles of the convention, the 5 titles of the convention. So this is the Maritime Labour Convention. It's a text of over 100 pages. It's not your typical ILO convention, as you can see. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is really about what makes this instrument unique within the context of the ILO, because there is no other instrument in the ILO like the MLC. And notably, one of the first reasons why it is so different, it is because it was developed to become the 4th pillar of the international maritime regulatory regime, together with the 3 other fundamental conventions from the International Maritime Organization, which are focused more on preventing pollution at sea, ensuring ship safety and security, and ensuring the training and regulating the training and competencies required for seafarers. The MLC combines 3 different approaches, and this is, again, unique in the international regulation. On the one hand, it combines the ILO features and the ILO approach, so it includes the aspects of tripartism, ensuring that, or requiring that there are independent labor inspections and inspectors conducting inspections in the maritime sector. It provides for a complaint system for seafarers on board and on shore, and this complaint system is backed by the general ILO supervisory system. Secondly, it also embraces the features of the International Maritime Regulatory Regime, and this means it has the teeth that sometimes the other labor instruments do not have, which means it has a system of flag state inspection and certification, which is then complemented by a system of port state control, including of ships flying the flags of countries that have not ratified the Maritime Labour Convention. And this is the third and also very important feature. It is this economic and trade feature, which is the fact that the convention includes a no more favorable treatment clause, meaning that even if a country has not ratified the convention, it can be, or it must be, by the other states that have ratified the convention. If it comes to a port of a state that has ratified the convention, to ensure fair competition, that ship can be inspected to ensure that it meets the requirements that are set out in the convention. And this is unique There is no other ILO convention that has this mechanism, and it comes from the experience that some IMO conventions had already included, but also from this main objective of the Maritime Labour Convention, which is to ensure decent work, yes, to this double objective of the Maritime Labour Convention, which is to ensure decent work for seafarers, but at the same time to ensure fair competition for ship owners. So, what are the other unique features about the MLC in the context of the International Labour Standards System? First of all, it required a high number of ratifications for its entry into force. So usually an ILO convention can enter into force after it has received ratification by 2 member states. For the MLC, in order for this level playing field and fair competition to work, the members decided that it was necessary to achieve a minimum number of ratifications from members which had a maritime interest, so which represented a significant or a minimum amount, let's say, of the world fleet. So for the entry into force of the MLC, it was set that 30 members representing a total share of 33% of the world fleet would need to have ratified the convention before it could enter into force. And from the beginning, it was expected that this would take approximately 5 years to achieve. So an action plan was developed to ensure that this result could be achieved in that time frame. It wasn't exactly that, but it was almost there. The second important principle of the MLC, which is not existing in other conventions, is that the principle of firmness in rights and flexibility in implementation. What does this mean? It means that the convention sets a minimum standards, and these should be applied to everybody, but it includes within its provisions binding and non-binding provisions. And this is inexistent in any other ILO convention. So ILO instruments are conventions, which are binding once ratified, which are creating obligations for the members who ratify them. So fully binding in all their provisions, and it includes also, it has also recommendations, which are only guidelines given to member states. So these are the 2 typical ILO instruments: conventions, treaties, legally open for ratification, legally binding once ratified, or recommendations which only give orientations on a certain topic. The MLC is binding as an instrument, but it includes different types of provisions. It has articles and regulations, which are fully binding, and then similarly to the IMO instruments, to the International Maritime Organization instruments, it has what is called the Code, which includes mandatory standards and non-mandatory guidelines. And these guidelines have a slightly different legal value than ILO recommendations, because although they are non-binding, the member states still have to report to the ILO whenever they are providing their reports on the application of the convention. They still have to indicate how they took those guidelines into consideration when implementing the standard that the guideline refers to. So it's what we call a principle of vertical integration, whereby you have a regulation which sets the principle that needs to be respected, and then a standard which provides more concrete information on how that principle should be implemented, and then the guideline which gives more practical details on how this standard could be translated in law and practice by the state in question. Another unique feature about the MLC is this simplified process of amendments, which was a request from the Geneva Accord, meaning that normally, as I said before, to revise an ILO convention, you need at least 2, let's say 3 years, or maybe earlier, to set the issue into the agenda of the International Labour Conference. And this is done by all the member states of the ILO at the International Labour Conference. The process of amendments of the code of the MLC is much simpler. It is done through a special tripartite committee that was created by the Maritime Labour Convention, composed of representatives of ship owners, seafarers, and governments, which meets regularly. It has met already 4 times since the entry into force of the convention, as we will see. And this means that the code, so the standards and the guidelines that I was referring just before, can be revised by this special tripartite committee, who just adopts the necessary changes, and once adopted, these changes are just presented to the International Labour Conference for simple approval. So the International Labour Conference cannot make changes to the provisions that were adopted by the Special Tripartite Committee. They can only approve or reject them. And once approved, there is a principle of tacit acceptance of the amendments to the Convention, meaning that if a state doesn't say anything within a period of 18 months, the amendments will enter automatically into force without an additional need for action from that state, with some exceptions. And another unique feature about the MLC, and perhaps this is important because during the discussion on the Commission on the Future of Work, this was an instrument that was very much talked about and was seen as something that could inspire the regulation of other new aspects in the field of work that are relevant for the future of work, notably platform work or work in the digital platforms. What is unique about the MLC is that it is a convention that was adopted after almost 100 years of reflection, social dialogue, application of standards in most of the subjects covered by the MLC, and which benefited from the experience of another international organization which already applies some of these innovative features in its own instruments, so the International Maritime Organization. And it has a very strong history of representative, open, constructive, and let's say, I would say strong social dialogue also at the international level. So when we talk about the shipping sector, we are talking about representatives of ship owners and representatives of seafarers, which are truly representative and who really know the sector and who want to have international regulation. Because it's a sector where if you don't have international regulation, you cannot function due to the very big conflict of jurisdictions, or let's say contact with different jurisdictions that it involves. So whenever we talk about using the MLC as an inspiration, I encourage you to reflect on how this could be used as an instrument, or these features could be encouraging to develop new regulation on these new forms of work that we are now discussing also at the international level. But bear in mind that it is a very specific sector with a very strong tradition of fruitful and constructive social dialogue. So 10 years later, where are we? The MLC, as I said, it didn't get the necessary ratifications within the 5 years that were planned, but 6 years later it did have the necessary ratifications, and it entered into force on the 20th of August 2013. So we are now celebrating the 10th anniversary of the convention being in force. And over these 10 years, we have already seen a lot of the impact that the convention translated to the life of seafarers and to the regulation of the sector. So currently we have 102 ratifications, but although the ILO has 187 member states, they are not all having maritime interests. For example, Austria has not ratified the Maritime Labour Convention because it didn't consider that it was a relevant instrument because it doesn't have a maritime fleet, a shipping fleet. And what's important to see is that these 102 members represent almost 97% of the world fleet. So basically, we are missing 3% of the world fleet. We have the majority of the big flags have ratified the MLC. The main labor supplying states have ratified the MLC. We're only missing Ukraine, but we are working with Ukraine, but for obvious reasons, we're not expecting the ratification immediately. But just to say that we are now expecting to increase the ratifications, and the new number or aim, objective set by the ship owners is that we reach 150 ratifications. That's the next aim that we will all be working for. Regarding the implementation of the convention and the aspects of supervision and enforcement, the ILO supervisory body who looks at the reports of member states on the application of the convention. So every year, the governments have to provide to the ILO reports on the applications of the conventions that they ratified. And for the moment, these reports are analyzed by the ILO Committee of Experts on the application of convention and recommendations, which is a group of 20 independent and impartial, reputed lawyers, jurists, judges, which meet every year in Geneva. And since the entry into force of the MLC, the Committee of Experts has already analyzed 90 first reports. So we have 102 ratifications, 90 first reports were analyzed. Some of those ratifications, for 2 of those states, the convention is still not in force because there is a time between the ratification of the convention and the moment when the convention comes into force. So basically, all the member states that have ratified the convention have already been subject to the first examination of the Committee of Experts. And those who haven't will be probably this year at the November-December session of the committee. So in addition, the Committee of Experts has concluded that from this analysis, in some cases, the committee has already analyzed the application of the convention by a member state more than once. And the committee has concluded that the members all did an overall an impressive effort to implement the requirements of the convention, translate them into their laws and regulations. Another positive impact of the convention has been that the ILO has been working with the Memoranda of Understanding on Port State Control. So member states have to control the ships that arrive to their ports, and they, in some cases, establish regional agreements among different port state control authorities to ensure a coordinated and more harmonized implementation and approach towards this enforcement of the provisions of the IMO conventions and of the MLC. And in 2016, there was a report, there was a concentrated inspection campaign by the Paris MOU, which covers the European Union member states. And overall, they concluded that there were, yes, some ships that were detained because they had deficiencies related to the application of the MLC, but it led to a decrease over the years. There was a decrease in the number of detentions, so there was an alignment, let's say, towards compliance by the member states regarding the application of the MLC. There are still challenges, and one of the challenges was felt during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the difficulties that were felt during the COVID-19 pandemic and the situations that were brought to light during the COVID-19 pandemic led the Paris MOU and the Tokyo MOU, which covers the regional, the Asian region, to establish a concentration inspection campaign on wages and seafarers' employment agreements, which will take place next year. So we hope that at that time we will have a better picture of what is happening in those areas of the implementation of the MLC requirements. We know that there were a lot of challenges during COVID. And the good news is that this concentrated inspection campaign will also include looking into the validity period, the contact information, and all the requirements that must be, all the information that must be provided in the financial security certificates that all the ships must have to ensure that the wages of seafarers are covered in case of, at least for a period of 4 months, in the case of abandonment of seafarers. So the other news is that, and this is unique, there's no ILO convention that has evolved so quickly in more than 100 years of ILO history. Since the adoption of the MLC and since its entry into force in 2013, the MLC has already been amended, modified 4 times. In 2014, to ensure financial security of seafarers, notably in case of abandonment, death, and long-term disability. In 2016, to include in the requirements that the ship owner must ensure when it deals with occupational safety and health on board, that it must have measures in place for the prevention and elimination of harassment and bullying on board ship. So this was even before the ILO standard, Convention 190 on harassment and bullying was adopted. So again, the maritime sector leading the way in innovation in the regulation of working conditions. In 2018, to ensure that in cases of piracy, seafarers and their families still receive the payment of wages even though they are in captivity by pirates. And in 2022, so just recently in April 2022, the STC adopted amendments to reflect already some of the challenges that had been felt during in the implementation of the convention during COVID. So when we hear that people complain that international organizations are slow and they take time to make decisions, well, here is an example that it is possible if you have the right tools and if you have the right social partners to engage with. So just would like to highlight some very important amendments that were adopted in 2022, which we hope will come into force in 2024. One of them is ensuring that seafarers on board have personal protective equipment that comes in different sizes. So this is something that you can think is self-evident. It is not. So, and that can make a difference between life or death for someone on board, to have personal protective equipment. If you're a woman or if you're of Asian descent, maybe your physical characteristics are different, and therefore you cannot have personal protective equipment of one size for all the seafarers on board. So this was something that was introduced as an amendment to the MLC. Another thing that also seemed self-evident, but the COVID-19 pandemic showed that it was not, was that it's not only food that needs to be provided free of charge for seafarers on board ships, also water needs to be provided free of charge. So it was not expressly included in the text of the convention, and one would assume that this was self-evident. Well, it turned out that it was not, and therefore the members introduced this amendment. And finally, something which was a very important issue that was missing during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was to ensure the access to internet to seafarers while they are on board and while they are on ports. So this was the cause of a lot of mental health issues during the pandemic, where seafarers were isolated for, in some cases, for over 2 years, not being able to return home, when the MLC says that the maximum period of service on board without going a ship is below 12 months, so usually 11 months. So this was something that was one big issue of concern, and we heard of cases during COVID-19 of seafarers getting desperate and even committing suicide. And just to give you some highlights of what were the challenges during COVID-19, so here you have an example, one example that where the ILO intervened directly was that a ship's captain died on board the ship, and the ship was refused disembarkation of the body for more than 5 months in different ports. It was after the ILO's intervention at the request of the social partners with the authorities through diplomatic channels that after 14 ports and more than 5 months, it was possible to disembark the deceased captain's body. So you can imagine if you're a seafarer and you're stuck on board a ship with a dead captain, and nobody allows you to release the body because there are fears, concerns, whatever, or somehow lack of information, and just a blanket justification that, oh, no, there is the COVID-19 pandemic, you cannot come on shore. Another issue, and the ILO had to deal with many of these cases, it was the case of urgent medical care. So we had situations where a seafarer had a stroke or heart attack, and it took almost 2 days to get them to be able to disembark at a port. So this is something that the committee of experts said, okay, during the beginning of the pandemic, during the first 3 months, we understand it was a case of force majeure. Nobody was prepared for what had happened. There was no way we could just overnight have in place the measures to continue to apply the convention as it was. But after several months, there was no more reason. There were measures in place. There were protocols, safety protocols adopted by the industry. There were health indications from the health authorities on how you should address these issues. So there was no more excuse not to continue to apply fully the convention as it was. So these were the challenges. We still have a lot of challenges. We've had a lot of results. We've had some impact. The convention is evolving, so we know it works. What are the challenges we're still facing? So one of them is, as I said, universal ratification, meaning ratification by the members with a maritime interest, and the aim is to get 150 members. Mostly, we are concerned about the member states in the Middle East area, so we don't have a lot of ratifications in that area, and this is very important that they become states parties to the convention. There are many cases of abandonment of seafarers in the region, and so this would be something that could contribute to ensure that these situations are dealt with in an expeditious way. We hope that this will come to pass shortly because we've had ratification by Oman, which is a very important maritime country in the region. The other thing is to ensure the harmonious implementation in the law and practice of the convention. So, as I said, the Committee of Experts said that there was progress by all states. It doesn't mean that all comply fully and that all enforce the regulations that they adopt in the same way. So this is something that the ILO is working with the member states to provide training, but also to raise awareness of the flag states, notably from the international registers or flags of convenience, that they need to play their role. It cannot all be left to the port state. Actually, the primary responsibility lies with the flag state, and they need to make sure that the ship owners or the ships that fly their flags comply with the rules of the Maritime Labour Convention. Finally, the issue about awareness raising about the MLC. So this is something that we are working on together with the International Transport Workers Federation, so the seafarers' representatives, but also with the IMO, and an opportunity to address this challenge might be the creation of a model course on the MLC that all seafarers would have to follow as they do courses, for example, on basic safety on board, because this would allow them to know their rights and to know the obligations of the ship owners and to know what are the conditions of work and living that they are supposed to have access to on board. And just one last point before I finish, why we think it's so important to ensure that decent work exists on board for all seafarers. So not only because it's a human right, it has to be a realization for all, but also because if there are no decent working conditions on board ships, it will be very hard to recruit and retain seafarers and to attract young people in the industry. And this is a sector that can be, it's a sector that has a potential for development, for developing countries. It can provide opportunities for young people to get access to qualified employment. There is a shortage of officers, and therefore it could be a way out. And this will not happen unless seafarers know that they will be able to get home to their families at least after 11 months on board. They will have good conditions of health and safety on board. They will be able to see a doctor if they have a problem while they are on board. Thank you.
I hope those of you that can stay. I would like to show you another picture of the ILO. So Sophia has shown you the normative side, which is very, very important for the ILO. There is another side to the ILO as well. Because the organization is very big. Only in Geneva we are 1,800 or so staff. And a big part of that are specialists like myself that support decent work at country level, that give support to countries to implement conventions such as the one that Sofia has talked about, but others as well, like the Employment Convention, Social Protection, Child Labor, etc. So and I wear that hat, like as a technical specialist on employment issues. So I am particularly working on youth employment issues, something that is extremely relevant for today, as things don't look great for the young generations that enter the labor market. So I'm going to focus my presentation here on a few trends and opportunities at the global level, going beyond Portugal and Europe, because we covered 187 countries, our member states, and then show you also a picture of how we see it in the ILO, how we would recommend, what we recommend to our member states and constituents, and why. Or at least I will try to show you that. How do you do it? This here? Yeah. Oh, sorry. So, starting with the challenges and trends, unemployment obviously is extremely high at global level. We count on 73 million unemployed people. Although many are employed, and a lot we don't know. Probably they are employed in the informal economy or with unpaid work. So one thing that I wanted to show you here is that unemployment, yes, is a very dire situation, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's only the main issue here is the 366 million youth working in informality. These are the youth that the ILO would like to access and help transit into a more formal and decent work. One of the issues as well that I want to highlight here is the fact that young people are affected often more than adults. And adults, it's in the UN definition, youth is between 15 and 24. But we regulate as the country likes. I think in Portugal it's up to 30, what is considered youth. But normally youth, regardless of the country, are more affected by shocks to the labor market than adults because of many reasons. Because of their lack of experience or the fact that they don't have certain collateral, skills, etc. Although skills is another issue to discuss, because nowadays the new generations are much more skilled than previous. This is something that I wanted to highlight. And young women in particular are very much affected by shocks such as COVID. So COVID was extremely hard on young people, in particular young women, and not only those that had already entered the labor market that lost their employment, but youth trying to get into the labor market that were not able to do so, and certain youth in education and training were locked down and could not access. It depended on the country and the learning institution. So here it's shown a little bit how the portion between adults and youth in terms of unemployment. You can see here that it's much higher for youth, and that in the next figure, that between 2019 and 2020. What went down during COVID was something, it was like a parenthesis of shocks and employment going up and down. So it's not really very informative of what normal trends look like. But these are relevant trends as well. Another part of the young population globally, but also in Portugal and in Europe, is the people that are not in employment, education, or training, the so-called NEETs. You can see here the total in blue in the middle, much higher for women than men. But you have to think about this as global. I mean, this is think Arab states, Africa, Latin America, and how it's an aggregate figure. But women are very high, and the reasons for this are different in different countries, in different cultures. But it is an issue because these are a part of the population that is very difficult to access. It's not like you are here at university, you know how the employment services work in your country. Often the needs are isolated, maybe dropouts, maybe women that have now children that cannot access care for their children. So it's a very vulnerable population that needs to be acknowledged here. So I wanted to show you this very gloomy picture: unemployment, informality, needs. This is unfortunately the global reality, and this is how with the issues that the ILO work with. Now, there are some lights at the end of the tunnel, or some opportunities that can come up from different investments, and I have included three issues here: the green economy, development of the green economy, the development of the digital economy, and care work. Those are three very important items that have, or sectors that have been strengthened, if you like, during and post-COVID. We are thinking more green. We are becoming more and more conversant with the digital, with a digital way of working, and care and the transition from work to care to training, the different life transitions, if you like, are becoming very important for the different populations. So here we have, with the University of Cambridge, done some modeling to some econometric modeling to maybe come up with different figures that could show us how these economies, the green economy, the digital economy, can create employment for youth, given an enabling environment and better policies. So these are trends that are also in daily life. I mean, we all talk about greening the economy, the issue of digitalization, etc. And climate change and greening the economy is something that is extremely close to everybody's hearts, but in particular, the younger generations have shown. For example, here in this figure, it shows the different aspects of or worries that young people have, and you see the first one, or you don't because it's so small, but climate change is a very big concern for young people, and obviously unemployment and health, education, etc. But it's very high up for young people. So there is a fear for the future, and then a possibility, married with a possibility for the future in a transitioning to a greener economy, a just transition, so, as we say in the ILO. But this is a completely different topic, so I won't go into that. So the digital economy is not only the platform economy, that is the first thing that one thinks of, but the digitalization of the economy is something that is going on in every sector of the economy and in all levels of economic development. You can see in this slide, it gives you a picture of high-income countries and then low and middle-income countries, and in different sectors, and to what extent the intensity of digitalization plays for youth employment. It's a little complicated as a slide, but for example, one big difference is on agriculture between low-income countries and high-income countries. Another issue that is interesting to look at is on the communications and financial sector. There is a big difference. So obviously, digitalization and connectivity varies from country to country and between economic levels of the in high-income countries or European countries. There is a very high connectivity. In certain parts of other continents, those connectivities are much lower. So that also creates inequalities, and this new digitalization of the economy can also create inequalities because of lack of connectivity. However, there is also the platform economy, the platform work, that is maybe what we all think about when we talk about digitalization. And here, the ILO has been working a little bit on, because there is certain fears of lack of security and regulations from the part of the workers. There is fear from the employers that if we regulate too much, then we will destroy part of the economy. Governments have also certain worries. So there has been an expert meeting a few months ago in the ILO that didn't really result in anything tangible, but afterwards, our constituents, workers, employers, and governments that believe that this is an issue that is extremely important, digitalization and platform work, is something that we really need to do something about in the labor market, and in particular for those that are entering the labor market, the young population. There is now a plan to discuss this in the International Labour Conference in 2025, which is good news. And also, I wanted to say that there are some relative advantages for young people in platform work because of young people being more digital savvy than older workers, but also because of the need for flexibility. There are many young people that create a family in the beginning of their lives, and they need this flexible working environment. So they see this as more closer to their way of living and working. But there is an issue of earnings, there is an issue of security, of data security as well. There are many, many issues that we need to look into, and that hopefully we will be able to do in the 2025 conference. So, some key messages of what's going on this very gloomy, sometimes gloomy situation of youth in the labor market. Mainly, I would really like you to take away the issue of the shocks being particularly hard on young people, and therefore a need for any policy to take this into consideration. And I will come back to this in my second part of the presentation on how what the ILO recommends. The issue of scarring is also something that is important to take away. The fact that if you enter the labor market not wrong, I don't know if that is the way to put it, but informally, there is a risk that you remain an informal worker, at least in developed economies. And that has consequences throughout life. And the COVID pandemic also caused shocks to the educational system in many developing countries, in particular. I mean, we're talking about years of lost education, and that has such an impact. And the global inequalities are important to consider here, between countries, continents, within countries, between ages, etc. And now we had been talking about the COVID crisis, the many shocks to youth. And now lately, because of the ongoing wars, unfortunately plural, and other issues, we are beginning to talk about something called polycrisis, and how this polycrisis influence the young population. The ILO is now developing its ILO Monitor. It's a publication that comes out every month or 2 or 3, depending on the issues that are ongoing. And in the next ILO Monitor, the issue of polycrisis will be looked into carefully, and in particular how it affects the different parts of the population, including women and youth. There's also, here I want to be cautious about how we see the data of the creation of jobs, for example, in the green economy. If you say we can create so many millions of jobs, it doesn't necessarily mean that those jobs that will be created will be for those people that have lost their jobs because of the greening of the economy. So this is something we need to be, these are all global figures, aggregated figures, so let's be careful. And also the need to the support of the transitions in the labor market. That is something that is newish in this future of work era. Before, we had a few jobs in a lifetime. We have maybe 5 different jobs after university or after school, or even 1. This is not longer the case. I mean, the transitions between jobs are becoming faster and faster, and even, from day to day even. So this the smooth transitions, supporting such smooth transitions are extremely important. Now, so ILO's response to this is, well, it is based on its normative work, obviously the many conventions, in particular Convention 122 on employment, and in particular there is a resolution from 2012 that is called the Youth Employment Crisis, a Call to Action. And you would think, so they were in crisis already back then. Yes. So we were just coming out from the financial crisis, and this resolution called for an integrated approach to youth employment that included 5 policy areas that were crucial at that point, which are all up in that in the blue part of the circle. So it's skilling, entrepreneurship, and it is rights at work, etc. So there are very important aspects that need to be taken into consideration in the economy when you do a policy. So I completely agree with those policies, macro policies as well. But things have changed, and this is something that we also acknowledge now through the ILO Centenary Declaration. No? I don't know if you're familiar with the Centenary Declaration from 2019 that took what was going on in the world at that point. The ILO had created a commission on the future of work with very knowledgeable people that discussed these matters and came out with recommendations through a publication called Work for a Brighter Future. And then based on that, or with incentives and some information from that, there was the International Labour Conference. And as you know, as was explained, in the conference there is tripartite discussions between workers, employers and governments to come up with, something that would be in balance for the economy. Other organizations, other UN organizations do not have that. They have governments or they have NGOs, etc. So the ILO has to negotiate with society to agree on a balance that everybody would be okay with, from the side of the employers, the workers, etc. And so the Centenary Declaration was born, but it was based on the Philadelphia Declaration that declared that work is not a commodity, and this is something that is central for the ILO, and many other statements like freedom of association, etc., and proposed a human-centered approach to the future of work. And the human-centered approach, you can see from on the other side of the circle, that suggests a different way of putting the individual, if you like, at the center, and working with institutions of work to make them more sort of workable for this era, but also on a macro level, the development of the creation of work, how this can be done today, and also the capacities of people, So, but there is a shift here. So instead of saying it is up to the individual to do it, to capacitate himself or herself, it is more the policies that have to change to facilitate a lifelong learning experience, for example. So this is a little bit how the ILO is seeing its work on youth employment going forward. You see, it takes into consideration the drivers of change, globalization, technology, the aging of society that plays an enormous role. Because today, young people try to get into the labor market, and many do so very well, but very many do not. And on top of that, we do have an aging society, so we need the young people that come in. We cannot create those barriers that are now there. So so that societies can survive, we need to be more smooth in letting and supporting people's entering the labor market. And this is something that the constituents are very much aware of and support a lot. So this is very close. This strategy is very close to their hearts, particularly workers and employers, but also governments, of course. So the issue is then, to sum up, promoting decent youth employment. Now, how do we do that? We need to create it. We need to find the destination. It has to be at every level, macro level. The fiscal systems need to reflect this need for young people to enter the labor market. Economic and employment policies cannot exclude the particular situation of a young person entering the labor market. We need positive support. We cannot continue asking of people something that they do not have without providing it. That's simple, indeed. And also, we need to invest in sectors and in economies that can support this transition into the labor market. So the path then would be lifelong learning. This is something that is very much discussed in the ILO today. The Singapore School of Lifelong Learning is a particular interesting experience that we study. Youth guarantees like the one you have in Portugal and in Europe in general are extremely important. Employment services, social protection for youth or universal social protection, subsidies for employment, entrepreneurship skills, and so on and so on. And another very important issue to develop quality employment is the issue of inclusiveness. And here, the targeting of those that cannot access the labor market is very important. It's very difficult to achieve. But there are also other issues that include rights at work, freedom of association, etc. And so this is the new direction that we see in policy development and implementation for youth. This matching of quality and quantity. And so it's not only that the responsibility doesn't lie on the young person to get skilled or get entrepreneurship skills to get a job, but that the policies themselves include a responsibility to create a better future for young people, based on what I was telling you about the Centenary Declaration and a human-centered approach. But also that these policies that we develop accommodate the drivers of change and other trends, and that they are constantly developed to be adaptable to this reality that changes from day to day. This is something that is very difficult, not only for the ILO, but for governments, for each government to achieve. Doing a national employment policy, I have supported several. It is a lengthy process. But we're almost saying that countries need to do this constantly. So what is the most important thing then in a policy? Is that to have the perspective of youth, a youth employment policy or an employment policy that integrates the youth aspect. And we've done some research that is forthcoming in the next couple of weeks on the topic of youth inclusive social dialogue. Because social dialogue is the ILO's recipe, if you like. And youth, and you have heard it everywhere, I think, in social media, etc. The voices of youth and the engagement of youth is something that is being discussed at all levels of society now. So this research found that, unfortunately, the inclusion of young people in social dialogue is not very common. During COVID, it became less common, and our social partners, both workers and employees, would have liked it to be more. So with that, we observed that there is a disconnect from social dialogue. There is a general disconnect of civil engagement. And this, again, it is at a global level. And there is a risk, that comes with a political risk that comes with this. So it is urgent to change this, to reactivate this, to create strategies that will accommodate a better connectivity of young people to social dialogue that would then create better policies for youth. This is why we had a meeting in November called Social Dialogue with and for Youth, and we had workers and employers, organizations and governments, and youth for the first time ever in the ILO. Sort of extended our mandate so that young people could be part of the discussion, could say what they felt in terms of, for example, one thing that all social partners, and we always discuss, is that, there is a mismatch of skills but the young people that were in the room, they thought, it was not really that they have a lot of skills. It is how the job descriptions, etc., were formulated that was wrong, because they have a lot of skills, and the youth unemployment issue cannot only be based on a mismatched, etc. So the discussions were quite intense, but very, very fruitful, and we ended with workers and employers in particular, but also governments. The Portuguese Minister of Labour was also part of this discussion, establishing that there is a trend that youth don't really trust in institutions and social dialogue, that there is a risk for a political risk, and we can see this in society. But there is a willingness, there is a big willingness of all parts of society to create social dialogue with youth. And this needs a political will from the government. It needs a strengthening of the mandate of the social partners of workers and employment. an expanded cooperation and partnership between social partners and youth, and but also the creation of infrastructure that will facilitate this, like youth committees. And also, lastly, I wanted to mention that at UN level, this is an issue that is being debated a lot, meaningful youth engagement. And we had some participation from other UN organizations in this meeting that thought, this is an area, social dialogue, the inclusion of youth, is something that can be extremely useful to show as a case of meaningful youth engagement. And with that, I think I will just wrap up because to have a few minutes of questions. These are some readings that in case you're interested, there's so much on the topic, but I have listed 3 that I particularly like, and 2 databases that are extremely useful if you're planning to do any work on this subject. But I will leave it up, I won't mention it, so you can take photos or write them down. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, now we have a space for questions, comments, right? You can feel free to ask our speakers what would you like to ask. You can do it in Portuguese if you want. We eventually try to translate if you are not comfortable with the English language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Aren't the unions prepared to listen the voice of young people?
Should I reply or I'll take a few?
Yeah. We can listen more questions. Okay.
Good afternoon. It's to Sara Amaral Oliveira. Do you identify any difference between the number of democratic countries that ratify MLC and the number of non-democratic countries that ratify MLC? And thank you very much for your seminar to both.
Any more questions?
There is.
So I have a few questions, but Ms. Marie, if I may ask, so wouldn't the shocks in economy influence more adult workers as they work longer in a specific sector and they are not as flexible as youth? What percent of work population is unemployed? And as I would think that there is some studies that 5% of unemployment is perfect for economy to work correctly. So if this unemployment of youth is really low compared to other unemployments, wouldn't it work well for economy? And also, wouldn't the climate change affect countries near with lower elevation more than countries without this elevation? So, for example, countries in like Bangladesh or Pakistan, wouldn't they have harder time adapting to climate change than European countries and some European countries? And for Ms. Sarah, I wanted to ask, some countries in Western world have really big fleets, and so wouldn't like 33% of world fleet be like 3 countries like USA and Great Britain and maybe France? Wouldn't that compare to 33%? So wouldn't countries with really small fleet in Africa, for example, wouldn't they be discriminated because of this? And thank you very much.
Well, you can respond to these first three questions, and then we are more 5 minutes to another round, okay?
Okay. Do you want me to go first? Yeah. Okay. So, in the question of unions, if they want to listen to youth, well, yes, they do. It is also true that when I have worked with unions and on youth-related issues, many times the person that comes to the meeting representing youth is quite old, because it's the structure of that, which is why. But there is a willingness, and this is something that the unions have expressed, along with the employers, that they need to access youth. They need to not only listen to youth, but they need to include youth in their ranks. So that's one thing. On the issue of whether adults would suffer more from the shocks than young people, well, here we talk about, for example, informal work. Informal, not with an I, formal. No, because you are protected. The longer you've worked, the more protection you have, and young people are just entering the labor market. It's like a last in, first out kind of approach, or they're not able to get in. So this is why this shocks. The lack of labor protection is an issue. Then you asked, and I link it to the second question you made on poor populations and unemployment. Okay, let me just, in Africa, for example, informality in some countries is up to 90%. So, and 5% of unemployment is, to say that there is 5% of unemployment is ridiculous. You can say that in Europe. I know Switzerland has 5%, which is, yes, it's ideal. It's like a in and out kind of, yes, perfect. But in a country where you have between 60 and 90% of informality, that is the issue. And where a large part of that percentage are people that are very, very young. And on the issue of climate change, if countries like Bangladesh, yes, of course, because in Europe we have the strategies we put in place, the crisis mitigation issues, and in poor countries that are now being hit very hard from different climate change, like there is now an ongoing storm in Pakistan and so on. The islands of the Pacific are sinking. Obviously, they are being hit much, much harder. And there is also a very interesting study done by the ILO on heat and work in heat, because the heating is increasing, and normally in India, etc. And that's, on that part of the world. So indeed, yes, there is very hard.
So thank you for the question. So I will start with your question. I think we can look at both more or less, because it looks at the ratifications and the ratifying countries. So indeed, the aim was to have a double criteria, to have two criteria when that would be required to be met before the convention came into force. And it was not only the percentage of the world fleet, but it was also the number of countries. So really the aim was to ensure that you would not have many countries ratifying, but that would represent 2 or 3% of the world fleet. That would not be enough, considered enough to push for the entry into force of the convention. And so we did have the big fleets ratifying. So Liberia was the first flag state to ratify the MLC, followed by the Marshall Islands, followed by the Bahamas. So you already have here a big percentage of the world fleet that is ratified. And then Panama and Norway. So you see, this is already a lot. And when the convention entered into force, we had the 30 members required, but they represented already 60% of the world fleet. And that was exactly the aim. It was to ensure that the biggest number possible of ships would be covered by the protection of the MLC. And regarding your question on the number of democratic countries that ratify the MLC and the non-democratic countries and the relation, so we don't look at that when we try to promote the ratification of the convention. So we try to look at how can we best ensure the protection of the seafarers. And just to give you an example, the US is a country that traditionally has a low level of ratification of ILO conventions, and it has not yet ratified the MLC. It has ratified the convention that is the most advanced before the MLC, which is Convention 147, but it has not yet transitioned to the Maritime Labour Convention. It is likely that it will do so because the ILO is in the process of ensuring that all international labor standards that are considered outdated are abrogated, and that the member states move towards the ratification of the updated standards. And most of the old maritime conventions have been considered outdated. So it is expected that by 2030, we will only have the updated standards in force, and that will be the MLC, Convention 188 on work in fishing, and Convention 185 on the seafarer's identity documents. But all these others, it is expected that the members will transit from those older conventions to the more modern and more encompassing standard, which will be the MLC. So I cannot answer your question in terms of the relationship because we don't look at that, but as an example, the US has not ratified the MLC.
We still have 5 minutes. I would like to raise the question to Cátedra, please.
So why would we say allow different countries to inspect their ships? Why would they allow that? Wouldn't they, like when Britain tried to do it in the 18th century, wouldn't they create embargo on those countries that would try to inspect their ships?
So that's the whole beauty of the system, because the enforcement system of the MLC is built like a house with different bricks, and it starts with the seafarer and it goes all the way up to the ILO supervisory system. So every actor has a part to play in ensuring that the MLC is effectively applied. So if it's true that it's the flag state that has the responsibility to ensure that the vessels flying its flag are complying with the standards, and decent work and decent working conditions are respected on board, then you have so they have to check it. They, in many cases, hire what we call recognized organizations, which are organizations which are certified at international level to conduct these inspections and prepare the certification of the ships. So many flag states do that. But then you have a counterbalance. So the port state, if a ship from a country that has ratified the MLC arrives at a port, the ship will have a certification that, in principle, it complies with the provisions of the MLC. It's called the Declaration of Maritime. Declaration of Maritime Labor conformity. And so when the ship arrives at the port, if it has this DMLC, there is a prima facie evidence that it is compliant. So, in principle, that ship will not be inspected if it is from a ratifying country. If it is not from a ratifying country, it does not benefit from this presumption of conformity, and therefore the port state is allowed to inspect the ship for compliance with the labor conditions on board. And this is the system of port state control. It is very common in the maritime regulatory aspect, so to inspect safety of the ships, to make sure that there are no pollution incidents, to make sure that there are no risks for the damage of the ship to cause a consequence to other to the people on board, or also to the environment. And the novelty, what the MLC comes to bring to this system that already existed, is that now we are also going to look at living and working conditions, and non-compliance with these living and working conditions will also be a cause for not letting the ship sail to the next port. So, yeah, I hope I replied to, but it's the rules of the game. It's really the fact that you can be subject to a full inspection when you arrive in port. This means you will have to stay longer in port. This will have an economic cost for you, and therefore you will not be interested in being not in conformity with the convention. So there is a pressure then at national level by the ship owners and the seafarers for the state to ratify the convention. So the impact of the no more favorable treatment clause is also that it promotes added ratifications of the convention, and even if a state ratifies and it does not comply fully with the whole system of enforcement, which in the end will go through the ILO supervisory bodies, so with the government having to prepare a report indicating what are the laws that implement the provisions of the convention and how it puts them into practice, will progressively lead to an improvement of the conditions and the compliance by that state with the requirements of the convention. So that's the rule of the game.